2 months before he became House Speaker in the wake of the coup against Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and then that protracted fight over who was going to be House Speaker, we interviewed Congressman Johnson, who is now the House Speaker, in order to question him about a variety of things. It was on the day when the FBI director, Christopher Wray, had appeared before a committee on which then Congressman Johnson served. And he was quite eloquent in his denunciations of the U.S. security state in general, its attempt to control the internet in particular. We asked him about that. We asked him about spying powers on the part of the government. He said he believes that those powers had been abused. He talked about the FBI and the abuse of FBI power. He talked about his opposition to the war in Ukraine, views that he steadfastly said he held, and that his voting record suggested he held. In 2018, he voted against the renewal of FISA, which is the bill that allows the FBI and the NSA to spy on Americans without warrants. And he also talked about his opposition to funding the war in Ukraine. And then he became Speaker, and a lot of things changed. He's now working, as we'll show you, to ensure that Joe Biden gets what he wants, and with another $60 billion to Ukraine. But he also, for inexplicable reasons, has become someone who is now dedicated to ensuring that this FISA spying bill, which was last renewed in 2018, which is now up for renewal again. If it's not renewed again, it will expire. And what many members of Congress on the left and the right are saying is that these spying powers are too broad. They're too limitless. Nobody wants to do away with the FBI or NSA's authority to spy. That's what those agencies exist to do. That's an important part of criminal investigations or foreign intelligence. The problem is that the NSA was supposed to be an agency that spied on non-Americans, on foreign adversaries. And yet, increasingly, what happened, and it was very predictable at the time when this law was enacted in 2008 under the Bush administration and allowed warrantless eavesdropping, is that they began spying on Americans en masse without having first to go to a court and get a warrant. And this requirement embedded in the Constitution is one of the fundamental rights guaranteed in the Constitution, that the government cannot spy on you, cannot listen to your conversations, cannot take your papers, cannot seize your property without first going to a court and convincing a court that they have probable cause that you actually did something wrong, that they have a reason, a legitimate reason to spy on you. The government's not supposed to be spying on American citizens, and yet they do it all the time under this bill that was first enacted in the name of the war on terror, and that has been repeatedly renewed without a single reform, including just a requirement of warrants. And so finally, when it was up this year, many people on the right, many Republicans in Congress, many on the left, many Democrats, said that they will not renew FISA unless it has serious reforms, serious protections for Americans. And yet, Mike Johnson, who originally said that he agreed that there needed to be reforms before FISA was renewed, earlier today attempted to bring to the floor a vote that would have allowed Congress to simply pass FISA with no reforms. And because it was a rules vote, technically, it's very rare that members of any caucus, the House Republican caucus or the House Democrat caucus, defy their leaders and defect on a rules vote. And yet 19 Republicans joined with all Democrats to vote no on bringing this bill to the floor. And as a result, it was not brought to the floor, and now it could expire without renewal. Now, one potential reason this happened is because Donald Trump, who had not commented on this until today, went to Truth Social this morning and posted this, quote, "Kill FISA. It was illegally used against me and many others. They spied on my campaign. GJT." Now, I actually almost went on Twitter yesterday and to complain that Trump hasn't yet manifested or spoken about this bill, and obviously he should, given his personal experience. But then I decided not to because I knew there was a chance that he might today and didn't want to seem like he was being pressured. And so I was glad to see that tweet, because obviously that's important in giving these Republicans the space and the license to abandon Mike Johnson as Speaker and vote no. Here from the New York Times today, its report on what happened. After Trump broadside, surveillance bill collapses in the House. Quote, right-wing lawmakers blocked a move by Speaker Johnson to extend a key foreign intelligence surveillance tool. Look at the New York Times. The New York Times was part of the Snowden reporting. My colleague Laura Poitras published several articles with the New York Times that reported on the abuses of the spying system. And yet, look at how the New York Times, because Trump and GOP lawmakers are opposed to this extension, and Joe Biden is in favor of it, look at how they herald this bill to make you think that it's some crucial bill vital to our national security that these big bad right-wing lawmakers and Trump are blocking. Quote, right-wing lawmakers blocked a move by Speaker Johnson to extend a key foreign intelligence surveillance tool after former President Donald J. Trump urged lawmakers to, quote, kill the law underlying it. In an upset on the House floor, the measure, which would extend a section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act known as Section 702, failed what is normally a routine procedural vote. On a vote of 228 to 193, 19 House Republicans, most aligned with the ultra-conservative House Freedom Caucus, joined Democrats in opposing its consideration. Do you see how, as well, they didn't note until the third paragraph in passing that Democrats also voted no on this? Nor did they say that while this bill is called a bill of foreign intelligence gathering, it is often the bill that is the power that is used to spy on American citizens without warrants. What they do is they say, oh, our target is not an American citizen, our target is a foreign national, but they can easily spy on many conversations of Americans without warrants by simply declaring foreign targets that they know are speaking often to Americans. A lot of Americans speak to people in Canada, people in Mexico, people in Europe. And so all the NSA or the FBI has to do is say those are our targets, and then they get to listen in on multiple conversations of American citizens without the warrants required by the Constitution. Those are the reforms that are being sought. Quote, such defections were once considered unthinkable, but have become increasingly common as the hard right has rebelled against GOP leaders. Quote, we will regroup and reformulate another plan, Mr. Johnson said after the vote. Quote, we cannot allow Section 2 of FISA to expire. It's too important to national security. I think most of the members understand that. Nobody, Mike Johnson, thinks that this bill should expire. The argument is that it should not be renewed without added protections to American citizens. And had Speaker Johnson been willing to allow votes on these amendments, to reform the bill, to limit it, to require warrants, then the bill could have passed easily and we wouldn't be facing the possibility that it will expire without renewal. But because Speaker Johnson sided with the national security hawks in the Republican Party, the people who always want to give the U.S. security state everything it wants, the part of the party that wants to fund the war in Ukraine, and decided to do their bidding and the bidding of the NSA and the FBI and the Biden White House, members of his caucus rebelled. The New York Times goes on, quote, under Section 702, the government is empowered to collect without warrants the messages of non-citizens abroad, even when those targeted are communicating with Americans. As a result, the government sometimes collects Americans' private messages without a warrant. Exactly, they often do. While there are limits on how these messages can be searched for and used, the FBI has repeatedly violated those limits in recent years, including improperly querying for information about Black Lives Matter protesters and people suspected of participating in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot. That's pretty significant abuse, to be spying on domestic political movements without warrants. That's why you cannot possibly renew this bill without reforms and protections for the privacy rights of American citizens guaranteed by the Constitution. Quote, Mr. Trump's attack on the measure underscored his lingering grievances about the Russia investigation and his disdain for national security agencies he often disparages as an evil deep state. And this has resonated with his hard-right allies on Capitol Hill, who see blocking the extension of the law as a way to inflict pain on the intelligence community they regard as an enemy. Now, the reason that Donald Trump is actually suspicious of the spying powers of the FBI and the NSA is because, as we know, they spied on Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. People associated with the Trump campaign like Carter Page, and they did so by filing false affidavits with the FISA court to the point where an FBI lawyer actually had to plead guilty to submitting false documents to the FISA court to get permission to spy on Carter Page and the Trump and people associated with the Trump campaign. And they've abused this repeatedly. Now, ordinarily, the New York Times would be objecting to the abuse of domestic spying powers by the U.S. security state, but the realignment that has happened, where Democrats are fully on the side of the U.S. security state, and their no votes today were simply procedural. They were opposing Mike Johnson's attempt to bring the bill to the floor. We'll see how they vote on the actual merits if it's rebrought. But that is the realignment, that the establishment institutions of American liberalism, like the New York Times, are now fully on the side of the U.S. security state, along with the Democratic Party. And maybe 5 years ago, they would have described this vote in a much more positive and praiseworthy way. They're now depicting it as some evil subversion, almost treason against our honorable intelligence officials that will jeopardize their benevolent and sincere desire just to keep us safe, even though they just got done saying that the FBI has repeatedly abused these powers for illegitimate domestic political ends. Here are the 19 Republicans from the Hill who voted to block the spying powers. They actually voted against Speaker Johnson's attempt to bring it to the fore. There you see the names. Andy Briggs of Arizona, Dan Bishop of North Carolina, Lauren Boebert of Colorado, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Michael Cloud of Texas, Eli Crane of Arizona, Matt Gaetz of Florida, Bob Good of Virginia, Paul Gozer of Arizona, Clay Higgins of Louisiana, Anna Paulina Luna of Florida, Nancy Mace of South Carolina, Corey Mills of Florida, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, Andy Ogles of Tennessee, Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, Matt Rosendale of Montana, Chip Roy of Texas, and Greg Stube of Florida. Now, there are many House Republicans, such as Jim Jordan and others, who actually oppose renewal of FISA without reform, but they weren't willing to defy Speaker Johnson on this rules vote. Remember, this was just a rules vote to bring it to the fore, and it's very rare to have defections because usually each party unites in support of their leadership on rules votes. But that would have allowed a vote on this FISA bill, on renewing the FISA bill with no reforms, and there was a significant chance, although it's hard to say for sure, that it would have passed. So these 19 House Republicans did not want to take that risk of allowing this bill to come to the fore because the U.S. security state in Washington generally gets what they want. Here's Elizabeth Gotine of the Brennan Center for Justice, one of the most informed experts on all matters concerning domestic spying, and she had an outstanding explanation for what happened. It's obviously not simple. And this is what she said, quote, Speaker Johnson has caved to the House Intelligence Committee's Bush League tactics and will block votes on a key reform when Section 702 authorization goes to the House floor this week. This was her thread from yesterday before the vote actually happened, but she was explaining what Speaker Johnson did. Quote, the base bill that the House will consider, the Reforming Intelligence and Securing America Act, RISA, contains no meaningful reforms. In fact, the bill would actually weaken the FISA court's oversight of surveillance. In February, members of the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committee had reached a deal with Johnson, under which he planned to bring RISA to the fore and allow each committee to offer 3 amendments. The amendment would end the government's practice of evading constitutional and statutory privacy protections by purchasing American sensitive information from data brokers rather than obtaining the warrant court order subpoena otherwise required by law. Remember, we reported on how the Director of National Intelligence admitted that that U.S. security state agencies are buying mass data on American citizens they would be constitutionally prohibited from collecting on their own. And one of the reforms that members of both parties wants is to ban them from being able to buy data on the private market about Americans. She went on, quote, Speaker Johnson has showed his true colors. His desire to appease House Intelligence Committee Chair Mike Turner outweighs any sense of responsibility he might have to the American people, and he is ready and willing to betray their trust. In New York Times today, notice that Speaker Johnson has changed his views on many positions he once claimed to have before becoming Speaker. Here you see the headline, as Speaker, Johnson advances what he once opposed, enraging the right. Now that he is the leader, the Louisiana Republican has found himself bowing to government realities that are now his problem. Quote, Johnson repeatedly voted down efforts to send aid to Ukraine before he became Speaker. Citing insufficient oversight of where the money would go, he opposed the stopgap funding bill that then Speaker Kevin McCarthy put on the House floor in an effort to avert a government shutdown. He supported a sweeping overhaul favored by libertarians to the law that undergirds a warrantless surveillance program that is reviled by right-wing lawmakers who distrust federal law enforcement. But now that he is Speaker Johnson, he has changed his tune considerably, much to the chagrin and outrage of the right-wing lawmakers with whom he once found common cause. After months of refusing to bring up a bill to send a fresh infusion of aid to Ukraine, Mr. Johnson is now searching for a way to advance it, having privately pledged that the Congress would, quote, do our job, meaning financing a foreign war. That's the job of Congress. Despite a vow in the fall never to pass another stopgap funding bill to keep the government open, he put forward several to allow more time to negotiate funding agreements with Democrats that were opposed by many of his members. And on Wednesday, the Speaker tried and failed to put to a vote a bill making more modest changes to the surveillance program over the objections of hard right lawmakers and activists who have sought to place strict limits on it. Now, one of the things going on here is that because there's such a small margin that Republicans have in their majority, if they just a few defect and refuse to support Mike Johnson as Speaker, he can be deposed. That's what happened with Kevin McCarthy. But the Democrats have told Mike Johnson that if he gets their number one priority passed, which is not anything to help the American people, but instead to finance the war in Ukraine, as the Guardian reports here, we can see it on the screen, the Democrats will protect Mike Johnson. House Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries suggests. In other words, if Mike Johnson gets that $60 billion passed that he had always said he opposed, Democratic leadership in Congress is telling Mike Johnson, we'll vote for you as Speaker and keep you as Speaker even if your right-wing members try and depose you. Quote, the Democratic leadership in Congress has suggested it would protect the Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson if he bucks his far-right colleagues and brings a stalled $60 billion Ukraine military aid package to a vote. As a new poll shows, public support for Ukraine is now fractured down party political lines. And Hakeem Jeffries, it goes on to say, said there's a good number of Democrats who would vote to save the Republican Speaker as long as he gets aid to Ukraine. Do you see the top priority of the Democratic Party and the game that Mike Johnson is willing to play to keep himself in power and serving the Biden White House's agenda by financing a foreign war that before becoming Speaker, Mike Johnson has vowed vehemently he opposed, and now he does the same thing on a spying bill that he said could not be passed without reforms, and now he's working to ensure its passage without allowing any reforms at all. It's a very good glimpse into the dirty, filthy game of how Washington is played, but actually it's good news what happened today. The 19 Republicans were willing to defect and defy him and vote no on bringing this bill to the floor, and enraged he was, according to reports, and threatened House members who voted no by saying, you will suffer serious consequences. We will certainly continue to follow this story since warrantless spying on Americans is obviously a very important story and one of the central causes of our journalism here. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.